Hey everyone, thanks for stopping in. My name is Anthony Paradis, and today I'd like to present a logic model for collegiate sport nutrition programs. But before we get any further, let's talk about who is this content for. And first and foremost, this is for sports dietitians in collegiate settings who want a comprehensive model just to make everything easier in your program. This is going to help to simplify all the moving parts. Well, theoretically, hopefully, and it's going to make things just easier from a big picture perspective. This is also for sports dietitians in non-collegiate settings who want a model, and there's just not a lot of other sports nutrition models out there, at least that I've seen, and so I invite you to adapt this to your own purposes. And then finally, this content is also hopefully to inspire any stakeholders in collegiate settings who have been thinking about starting their own sports nutrition program, but have maybe been hesitant about getting started just because of everything that's involved. This model may provide a conduit for you to start looking at what building that position might look like. So I developed this logic model in part to help me answer these really tough questions that I would ask myself as a program director for sports nutrition. And those questions are, what is the most effective way I could spend my time today? How can I be proactive and not just reactive? And what should I start on first? And I have found, at least for myself, that this logic model answers those questions, and it makes just getting to work and working on the most important things easier and more clear to me as a director. And I hope that you also find that this helps answer some of these questions for you in your program. So before we really get into the meat and potatoes of this, I'm going to take a second to talk about me. So my name is Anthony Paradis. I have a couple of degrees in nutrition and in education. I'm a sports dietitian, certified specialist in sports dietetics, CSCS, and the USPL stands for USA Powerlifting. I'm a director at a D1 sports nutrition program, and I currently was in private practice for myself. I owned a nutrition clinic and a training studio. As a hobby, I'm trying to garden most of my food this year, so you can see a picture of me there in front of my zinnias last year. And I'm an eclectic athlete. I never did the D1 or NCAA athlete. I was just I was a wrestler in high school. I did powerlifting. I've done a 500-mile backpacking trip before, and I've also competed on American Ninja Warrior, if you've ever seen that show. But that's just a little background about me. My specialty is in sports nutrition education and program development and evaluation, and that's really what we're going to get into today. But if you have any gardening tips for me, or you want to talk about powerlifting, feel free to shoot me a message too. I'm really interested in those topics as well. All right, so let's start with an overview of everything we're getting into today. So I'm going to start with a background on collegiate sports nutrition programs. I'm going to talk a little bit about logic models and their use for programs, and then we're going to get right into it. You can see the components of the CSN logic model here, and we'll go through all of these components of the logic model, and then I'm going to give you an example and talk about your next step in the big picture. So let's just start with some background, and we know as sports dietitians that nutrition's impact on performance and recovery is already well documented. The purpose of this presentation is not really to go into that in depth, but I invite you to check out my manuscript on the CSN logic model, which is linked on my website, and I do have some of the references and resources in the works cited on that. But moving on, so we know that it's well documented. We know that collegiate athletes benefit from nutrition support, and then let's look a little bit at the timeline. In 2007, right, that's not too long ago, we only had 13 D1 universities that had full-time sports RDs. In 2014 was that really big impactful deregulation of feeding with the NCAA. The CPSDA, had a major role in that as well. And so hats off to them and thank you. And then finally, here we are very recently in 2019, 92 D1 universities have full-time sports dietitians. So that is a big jump and certainly something to be proud of in this profession. So just to reiterate, that is almost 80 new full-time dietitians in the past 12 years. So that's a pretty big deal. However, there's still 265 D1 programs with the NCAA that do not have a full-time sports RD. And also the literature on sports nutrition program building is limited. It's still catching on. It's a new thing for collegiate programs. I mean, if we're really looking at the past 20 years. So that's some background on that. So moving on to logic models and how all this ties in is a logic model is, and this is a quote from the CDC on their depiction of their logic model. It's a graphic depiction that presents the shared relationships among resources, activities, outputs, outcomes, and the impact of your program. It depicts the relationship between your program's activities and its intended effects. So the activities and the intended effects, I mean, that's all about evaluation and improving our program. So with that background on sports collegiate nutrition and on the developmental part of the logic model, I now introduce my collegiate sports nutrition logic model. So here's an overview of the logic model, and it starts right here with situation and priorities. So what is the situation of your current athletics program? And after you sort of think about that, you're going to move on to this next step here where you answer a needs assessment to an athletic program, a team, and an individual level. We're going to find out some information at each of those levels. Then finally, you're going to take that assessment and you're going to develop your goals and objectives. And this really helps you to get to the implementing part of your program. The next step is inputs. These are the resources that will be required. The outputs are the services that you offer, and the outcomes are the fruits of your labor. These are the actual impacts that you have on an individual, team, and program level. And during the entire cycle process of this logic model in your program, you're going to be doing forms of evaluation to make sure that everything is running smoothly. And also so that you can have a report at the end, which is going to make gathering resources for future initiatives and getting support for future initiatives an easier process for you. Okay, so we start with the situations and priorities, and that is where I want you to do a lot of reflection and kind of just thinking about the community and the culture that you work in. You should be able to answer questions like, what's the socioeconomic status of the city that you're in? What is the sort of culture? You should be able to kind of see the program that you're in and the athletic department, get an idea of is it a strict budget environment? Are they really aggressive with this nutrition program? Just answer these sort of questions and think about all of the environmental and situation and priority factors that are going on. It's good to just reflect on this before moving forward. And then also a good way to do this after you do that reflection is to maybe set up some focus groups with some key stakeholders like your athletic program director, maybe some coaches, some athletes, and talk about what their perceived needs are and what they would like to see out of the program. And even though you're going to be the expert in how that looks like with objectives and really defining that, just the act of getting their input is important for that collaboration and for getting that support. Okay, so now we're moving on to our needs assessment, and that needs assessment is really going to occur at 3 levels. It's going to occur at a program level, a team level, and an individual level. And the reason for that is so that we can set objectives at all of those levels, but it also gives you some room to see where you can make some improvement, or maybe where you didn't make some improvement, where if you're only looking at one level, it's kind of hard to get the big picture. So there's different ways we can do assessments. We can do assessments with a formal assessment, and you can do things like in-depth interviews, focus groups, food journaling. We know that we can do our body composition testing. You can do surveys, but don't discount the power of informal assessments, and that's something just like going and observing the dining hall, seeing what the student athletes are eating, or taking a look at what sort of things that the coaches are offering the athletes during practice, if anything at all. Or maybe just some unstructured conversation, stopping in and talking to a coach, talking to an athlete, and just getting some information. So conduct your needs assessment on the program, team, and individual level, and consider using some combination of formal and informal assessment. So now that you've done your assessment, it's time to interpret those assessments and develop your goals and objectives. So a goal is kind of the main idea of what we're trying to get to in general. And so what I propose in general for a sports nutrition program, that goal is to provide education and resources that increase the likelihood of student athletes making food choices consistent with the current standards of sports nutrition science and practices while maintaining compliance with NCAA regulations. Well, that's a mouthful, but that basically boils down to that your athletes are going to be making good food choices that result in their performance improving. Now, the way that we break that down into objectives is where we get to the kind of the measuring and evaluation part of our program. So let's go to the next step. So now we're getting to our objectives, and these are really the measurable components of our program goals, and really what we choose to measure. So I've defined this in 3 different levels. Okay, we have a short-term, a mid-term, and a long-term outcome. And that is more something that we'll get to more in the outcome level, but we want to begin with the ending in mind. And so what that means is that our objectives are also going to be tied to our outcomes. So if you have a picture of the model in front of you, you can sort of see where those two link together, but I'm taking advantage to kind of break that down here. So the first level would be something short-term, and we know that short-term we can at least have an impact on knowledge. So right after you give a presentation or have some sort of nutrition education intervention, you could maybe give a quiz at the end or some sort of assessment to say, hey, I actually have measurable improvement in diet knowledge. And then the next thing you could set an objective with would be maybe diet quality. Maybe you want to see your athletes increase their protein intake or increase their fruit and vegetable intake. And you can determine that through a food log, maybe a before and after. You take one in the beginning of the semester, and then after you do your education interventions, see if they're actually making some changes. And then finally, we know as sports dietitians that an athlete who is educated, who is making good food choices, is going to have some improvements in their performance indicators, and those are things like body composition, testing at the beginning and at the end of the off season. And the reason why it's important to make to measure at each level is because you sort of lose control and ability as the levels go further. So we know that we can certainly have an impact on knowledge, but it's more up to the athlete if they want to make those food choices. And even then, there could be some external or internal factors that don't really translate into a performance indicator, one that maybe we can even measure, or one that comes up in a significant measurement. So the point is that if you have something at each level, you can sort of see where something drops off, you can see where you have your greatest strengths, and you can see where you can make improvements for next time. So now that this sort of planning and preparation phase is turning into inputs, we can talk about the resources that are required to run the nutrition program. And so I give you different categories for inputs. You're going to, of course, need some financial support. You're going to need equipment and materials, such as a body fat measuring device, a bioelectric impedance, or a skin fold caliper, or something if that's something that you've set as an objective. You certainly need building space. Where's your office going to be? If it's close to the athletes, that's probably a plus. If you're not located very close to them, that could be a barrier. Also looking at collaboration efforts. So do you have support from the nutrition department? Do you have support from the exercise physiology department? Even from the agriculture department. I've gotten my ag department to grow food for my fueling station. So there's many different collaboration efforts that can be kind of looked at as a resource. And then finally, human resources. And of course, I've broken that up into 3 layers as well. And you can look at the short term, midterm, and long term. Student volunteers to maybe an internship rotation, and then a long term human resource would be when you finally get that assistant. But it's important to have good managerial skills and some sort of documentation and some sort of plan for an interaction with human resources on any of these levels. Make good use of your student volunteers, make good use of your internship rotations that you hopefully precept, and then of course we want to have a lot of structure for our assistants and people that we bring into permanent positions into our program at some point. So once you have all your resources in line and everything you need, we can now start focusing on outputs, and these are the services that you offer. And there's 3 levels of outputs because, of course, we have 3 levels of assessment. So we can do something for individuals, we can do something for teams, and for programs. So at the individual level, common outputs might be something like counseling. It could be assessments you do or screenings. Let's say an athlete comes in, you give them a survey that might screen them for disordered eating. On the team level, we can offer things like educational workshops, also known as team talks. You can help a team develop their own nutrition policy. You can develop fueling stations for a specific team, training table, or distribute information, maybe leaflets or something that are team focused. And then of course from a program level we can do some of those things as well. This would be like a program-wide nutrition policy, program-wide fueling stations, so on and so forth. If y'all have read my manuscript, you've seen that I include evaluation at the end, and that sort of makes sense. At the end of a program you might evaluate it, but I want to take a moment to talk about formative evaluation here. And formative evaluation is focused on improving the pieces of the system. So in other words, all of these services that you offer, those deserve evaluation for each of their components to make sure that you can improve those as well. So some example questions that formative evaluation may seek to answer would be, hey, is there something that's keeping the athletes from participating in nutrition counseling? Right? Maybe only 30% of the target athletes come in on their own accord. Another question might be, are my team talks effective in transferring knowledge or changing beliefs? So just because you talk to a team doesn't mean that it was impactful. Let's try to evaluate that and make sure that we're getting better. And then finally, how can I get better survey responses? So if you've ever sent out a survey before and you're experienced with survey, you know that the bane of your existence is just getting them to respond to it, especially if it's an email format or something like that. And those may be things that you may have to evaluate. So for example, with surveys, I mean, that's something that I kind of consider a interest of mine. You can get different impacts from how you format that survey. It could be online, it could be an in-person survey, it could be something that's, you may have different outcomes if it's distributed by you versus if it's distributed by the coach. And there's lots of literature on that to kind of help you make an informed decision. with that as well. So formative evaluation could also include just some research. And also also with formal and informal evaluation, remember that you can do both kinds. You can just do something informal like investigating something by observation or by conversation, or maybe just by involvement with a process that you're doing and just judging for yourself if it's effective or not. But we can also do formal things like surveying our participants, or scheduling a focus group or something like that. So those are all methods of formative evaluation that you can use to improve anything from your assessment to your inputs to your outputs. All right, so now let's talk about outcomes. And this is, where we get excited, because this is really why we're doing what we do. We want to see that impact on our athletes, and we want to see them improve and be healthier and improve their performance and all of those things. So outcomes are really the fruits of your labor. And then we have short, mid, and long-term outcomes, and these are kind of matched to our objectives in a way. At the individual level, we have our knowledge gains, behavior changes, and changes in performance indicators. So once again, you could, do a knowledge test after doing a series of educational interventions. You could look for improvement in food quality, or maybe improvement in food storage or shopping if you're looking for behavior change. And then finally, that performance change could be something like you raised their iron levels in previously low iron, or you improved their body composition in some way. Now, at the team and program level, there's not as much resources such as like previously validated surveys, things that, we sort of have in our toolbox as a dietitian to work with individuals. We know that there's, probably 5 different ways to get a food journal from somebody without really even having to go into the research. And if you go into the research, there's 100 different ways to get food behavior data out of somebody. But at the program level, we really don't have that much. And it's going to be a little simpler. So these outcomes I've defined as raising awareness of nutrition issues, getting a commitment to change, and then finally a permanent adoption of that change, which leads to some sort of impact. So an example of that would be that I talked to my program director about how the athletes aren't really able to use their meal plan effectively, and how a fueling station will solve that problem. And then maybe at some point the director says, hey, you know what, I've set aside some money for this and we're going to pursue that. And then finally, we would consider that a long-term change when that director and you build that fueling station, and it now becomes a permanent part of the program. So the summative evaluation is really where you see the overall outcomes of all your initiatives at the end of the program, or just kind of looking at it at a big picture evaluation sort of way. So many of your outcomes should be tied to the objectives in this evaluation. So a pre-post test is a very common and tried and true way of showing impact. But there's other outcomes may also be discovered upon evaluation that you didn't necessarily plan for. So be open-minded to still maybe investigate those things, and you can investigate those without having taken a pre-test. You can do that by maybe doing follow-up interviews. You could have a focus group to, maybe assess perception of impact or change. You can also do this thing called a retrospective post-test, and that's where you ask somebody at the end of a program to assess what their level of knowledge was before they started and what their level of knowledge was after the program. You might have them rate it on a 1 to 5 scale. You can also use observation in this case as well. But your summative evaluation is going to be on the overall outcome and those big impacts that we like to report to our athletic directors and our stakeholders. All right, now we've done our summative evaluation and we have a really good idea of what's been going on with our program. Well, now we need to report that because we need to share this information. So I recommend preparing a couple of reports. The first thing I'm going to recommend is that you prepare a 1 to 2 page impact report, and this is going to be sort of your marketing manuscript for letting your athletic director and the teams know what a great job you did. This is going to talk about your contributions to the program, and it can also talk about some of your needs and some of the resources that you'll need moving forward. So this is going to be a little bit simpler report, and it's going to highlight some of the best things in your programs. And it's also going to underscore some of your greatest needs. But then I also recommend developing a technical report, and if you went through all of this work anyway, you might as well do something that you can use internally. So this would be great to share with your assistants, or for your assistants to report to you so that you can kind of get an idea of their impact as well. And this can also be used for formative evaluation of any process that you had developed, or any system that you developed. You can look at it and be kind of make some decisions based on that. And then also a very, very valuable characteristic of this technical report is that you could share it with other professionals in the academic and sports nutrition community. And what I hope is that with more reporting and kind of more ubiquitous types of reporting, that we may see a greater growth in the sports nutrition and sports dietetics field. So once again, before we summarize, here is the logic model, and you're going to start here with your situation and priorities, and you move through your needs assessment, which helps you develop your goals and objectives, and your inputs and outputs come together to create the outcomes of your program. You're going to have evaluation methods along the way to improve the program, and you're also going to have a summative evaluation to report on what you've done. And of course, you can see up here, I didn't talk about this in the beginning, but you have assumptions and external factors that are going to affect these things that may or may be something that you're aware of, or may not even be in your control. But that is the model in its entirety. And so let's move on to our final steps. And I just want to take a moment to talk about how you can organize all of this into like an action plan for yourself. And one way that I do this is through a Gantt chart. And basically all this is, it's an Excel spreadsheet that has the months laid out of it, and then the nutritional outputs or the services that I'm going to be providing. And you can use little blocks to highlight in when you're going to do that. So that way, you know, anytime you sit down, you can sort of look at this, you look at this logic model, you look at this chart, and you know exactly what you need to be working on. The timeline is never something that gets sort of mixed up with everything else, and it just helps to keep me organized. If you find this useful, then all the more power to you. A lot of people do this in a lot of different ways. This is just an example of what I use. So in summary, the collegiate sports nutrition model has the potential to help program directors plan, implement, and evaluate and report on the impact of their nutrition programs. Another thing I also want to point out is that not all data points are useful. Make sure you know the difference between evaluation for program development versus more of a research-based mentality. If you're going to take an assessment, or if you're going to be tracking a variable, make sure that it's something that leads to an impact, or makes it into your report and leads to something else. Don't collect data points that you're not going to do anything with. And so ultimately, increasing the breadth and the depth of sports nutrition reporting may lead to positive outcomes for the profession. And the way that it will do this is by better communicating impact and value to key stakeholders. Hey guys, now that you're done checking out my logic model, I want to invite you to go to my website where you can check out a toolkit. So just go to Anthony Paradis RD, and you can see my CSN logic model is right there. So here is the toolkit, and before I get any further, please fill out my brief survey and let me know what you thought. Anyways, the toolkit is down here, and so I include a lot of links to assessments, different apps, different research, and examples of components of the CS and logic model. And then at the end, I even give you guys an example of my impact report down there. So I built this for other sports dietitians so that you can just get started right away, and I hope you guys find this helpful. So go to my website, please fill out that survey, and let me know what you think.